September 4th, 1804, in the harbor of Tripoli in North Africa. And we're gathered here in many ways to remember him. And each of you also has an obligation to go forward and say what you heard here. Because at one time, this remembrance of Richard Somers was not just held by a handful of people in Somers Point. At one time, every school child in America knew the name Richard Somers. Everybody knew about that forgotten war in Tripoli. Everybody knew of a time when Americans once said, "Millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute." So thank you again for coming here. I'd also like to thank some of the elected officials who are here. I see John Risley, our freeholder. John, where are you back there? Hi. Okay, in the back. You can recognize him. He's wearing a tie in his weather. We have Mayor Jack Glazer here. Welcome, Mayor. And we see retired Admiral Ron Denny here. Thank you very much for coming. Are there any dignitaries who I overlooked that I'm going to hear about? Councilman Carl Diadamo is in the back. Thank you, of Somers Point. And by the way, this event is sponsored by the City of Somers Point, by the Somers Point Historical Society, and by libertyandprosperity.org. I'd like to introduce Sally Hastings, the president of the Somers Point Historical Society, who has been working on this event every year since the 200th anniversary of this incident. And Sally, thank you very much for putting this together.
Thank you very much for coming. We're going to start off with the flag ceremony, and the Boy Scout Troop 55 is going to raise the flag for us. The flag this year was flown over the American Embassy located in Tripoli, Libya. And so that's a special flag. It was presented to Mayor Jack Glazer about 6 years ago. One of the, I think it was a Marine, possibly, came to the city of Somers Point and actually presented him this particular flag. So I'm going to turn this over to Boy Scout Troop 55. Please rise. Because today is also 9/11, they're going to put it at half staff. Pledge of allegiance, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated.
Thank you. It's been a tradition since Liberty and Prosperity has been involved to reintroduce many Americans and people from New Jersey to the symbols on the New Jersey flag. Mr. Barkoff, I'd like to, if you could maybe have me hold the poll, we could hold this out. Very often you see the flag of the state of New Jersey and you see those two ladies standing next to each other. One of those ladies is the goddess of liberty. And you can tell her because she's on the left, holding the cornucopia, the unlimited goods, the prosperity, the bounty. To her right is another goddess, the goddess of liberty, carrying a long pole and a red cap. The red cap was a symbol of the American Revolution. According to legend, that red cap was worn by Roman slaves who had won their freedom. Back in ancient Rome, it was believed that slaves had tattoos of their masters on their heads. And if they won their freedom because of a kind master, or they bought their freedom, or they won their freedom in the gladiator games, they would wear their red cap to say, I used to be a slave, but now I am free. And that became the symbol of just the American Revolution, the French Revolution. Many Latin American countries have that as well. The pole, or the pike, the liberty pole, that also has significance as a symbol of liberty and freedom. That was the weapon of the common man in Europe. Every farmer had a long wooden pole to defend himself. But if one farmer would try to defend himself against a knight with his sword and shield and horseback, he would not stand a chance. But if one farmer's liberty was threatened, and every farm in the county, hundreds and thousands of farmers would turn out with those simple wooden pikes, they could overwhelm the knights, knock them off their high horses, and preserve their liberty. And so that's a symbol today that if you see someone else's liberty being threatened, if your attitude is, well, it's not affecting me, it's not my problem, that person will be crushed just holding his little wooden stick. Therefore, it's the obligation of every American to use his power to defend the liberty of everybody else, and that symbol is also on the New Jersey flag. And thank you. Now, every year we tell the story of Richard Summers, and I got involved in this in 2005. And in 2004 there was the 200th anniversary of the death of Richard Summers, and we had a wonderful ceremony. I believe it was at the Summers Mansion. I really don't remember, but it was a good ceremony. And then the following year, 2005, I was wanting to attend another ceremony, and I was told that one was not planned. So Liberty and Prosperity worked with various other groups to put together a ceremony, and I ended up giving the talk about Richard Summers. Now here's where it gets remarkable. From 2005 to 2015, those 11 presentations, I would be asked to give a talk about Richard Summers to basically the same people telling the same story. And you would think it would get a little boring to doing that. But what is amazing is there are so many angles and elements to the Richard Summers story that I can truthfully say, and I think those listening to me know, that I did not ever repeat myself, it seems, because there was always a new angle to the story. I don't know if I could keep the promise this year, but I did learn a lot of interesting new things. Also, a regular is a historian named Chip Reed, naval historian, military historian, and he's going to give the first presentation. Of course, anyone who's been attending knows that he and I don't always agree on some conclusions from this history, but it's always interesting. I always learn from him. I hope he's learning something from me. But Chip Reed has written some interesting books. One is called Intrepid Sailors, which goes into detail of the story of Richard Summers and the events that led him to his death, and how his death inspired his fellow Navy officers not to let the struggle be lost, and to bring Marines to the shores of Tripoli the following year. And I also just noticed that Chip Reed either co-authored or edited a second book called, I think it's called The Lion of the Bay, or it's called The Lion in the Bay, which is the story of the British invasion of Chesapeake Bay and the burning of Washington during the War of 1812. which it just seems that Chip Reed can't get away from controversy, because now with all the controversy over the national anthem and what it really means, I suspect that some of the details of that story are in that book, The Lion in the Bay. So without further delay, Chip Reed from Annapolis, Maryland. Thank you very much for joining us.
Both books are available on Amazon.com just in time for the Christmas shopping season. Usually I kind of drone on. This year I wrote things down and I timed it at 8 minutes and 17 seconds. So we're going to move. The Yankees are playing. We come together today amidst a mix of emotions. We come to celebrate the heroism of and grieve for Richard Summers and 12 others who selflessly gave their lives for this country. And on this day, we grieve for 3,000 people brutally murdered 15 years ago. We grieve, but we do not despair. We grieve for the firefighters, for the police, EMS, accountants, electricians, maintenance workers, stockbrokers, waiters and waitresses, all those murdered that clear, bright day on September 11, 2001. We grieve for the life of Richard Summers, whose career, which seemed so bright and so limitless, ended so tragically on September 4th, 1804. We grieve that he and his crew remained confined in a foreign land, subject to the whims of a hostile people. We don't despair, because the fight to bring them home continues. While we grieve, we celebrate and we remember. We remember the birth of Richard Summers, whose bravery has inspired generations of naval heroes. We celebrate the bravery of his crew, who volunteered for a mission they knew was likely one way, and we celebrate the bravery of the first responders and all those who rushed into danger to save others 15 years ago today. We celebrate the lives of our loved ones who died in the attacks, and we remember the times that we had with them. It is why we can grieve and not despair. Richard Summers willingly gave his life that day in 1804. I like to think, thanks to my book. We now know what happened the night he died. Summers knew the secrecy that once shrouded his mission was gone. He knew there would be enemies waiting for him. He gave his 10 enlisted men and his second in command, Henry Wadsworth, the opportunity to back out of the mission. All volunteered to remain on the Little Intrepid. Summers made it very clear what he would do in the event of an attack on his vessel. His mission was to blow up the pirate fleet anchored in Tripoli Harbor, and he had turned the Intrepid into a floating bomb. The Intrepid carried enough gunpowder that if the pirates captured her, she would resupply their forces. Summers vowed to never allow that to happen, that he would blow up the Intrepid rather than let the enemy take her. So he went in. Many of his crewmen were British, deserters from the Royal Navy who found a new home in the United States and who were willing to die for their adopted country. His officers, Henry Wadsworth and Joseph Israel, who disregarded orders to join the mission, were men the Navy had already marked as up-and-coming leaders. They too promised to destroy the Intrepid rather than allow the pirates to take her. After setting off around 8 p.m. the night of September 4th, the Intrepid made her way toward a line of shoals that marked the entrance to Tripoli Harbor. There she ran into a pair of enemy gunboats, stationed near the reefs just in case Summers attempted to go in. The little unarmed Intrepid, with just 13 men, was no match for the two gunboats, and Summers knew it. According to a Turkish naval officer who was in Tripoli that night, Summers waited until the pirates were ready to board the Intrepid, then blew up his vessel. Eyewitness accounts of the aftermath describe more than 13 bodies washing ashore. It's always been a bit of a mystery as to why. The mystery was solved with the letter that I found tucked away in the Library of Congress that was described what the Turkish officer said. The extra bodies were dead pirates. Who among us would have the courage, the determination to do the same? We saw who 15 years ago. We see it today when a young man or woman walks into a recruiter's office and signs his or her name on the dotted line to serve 2, 3, 4, or 8 years for his or her country. We see it when people attend the police or fire academy, or when they simply reach out a helping hand to a stranger in need. Since 9/11, many have tried to connect what happened in 2001 to the first Barbary War that began in 1801. They were not alike, not even close. The first Barbary War was not a war of religion, it was a war of economics and of rights. Although in 1801 we fought a Muslim enemy, there was no demand America convert to Islam, no talk of a caliphate, no attempt, even in Tripolitania, which today is part of modern-day Libya, of imposing some hijacked form of religion on the populace. The Tripoli War was an economic war. The pirates wanted too much protection money, which drove up insurance costs, which drove up the price of goods. America lived by the ocean trade, and every time a ship or any time the Barbary States threatened to attack American shipping, insurance costs on those boats would go up. Obviously, if the insurance cost goes up, who's going to pay the higher prices for goods? Us. It was also a war over rights, the freedom of the seas and the right to conduct commerce. The Mediterranean was the most lucrative area for business at that time. It was the gateway to Asia. It was the gateway to the Middle East, the spice trade. And anything that interfered with the Mediterranean trade, again, hurt the American economy. Those that perpetrated the attacks on September 11 were completely different than the corsairs Richard Summers faced. The 9/11 attackers were cowards who used religion as an excuse to murder 3,000 people. That being said, there are similarities. In 1786, Thomas Jefferson expressed his concerns about Islam, penning a few lines that have become well known. Unfortunately, the sentences before and after those few lines have become forgotten. Jefferson worried about Islam not because he thought Jihad would destroy the new United States, but because it was the religion of many African slaves then in or on their way to America. And he worried if their owners imposed Christianity on them, they would rise in revolt. His insistence on religious freedom was fostered by a very real belief in liberty, but also, believe it or not, as a means to help slaves somehow feel better about their bondage. And you can read that in Thomas Jefferson's writings, which are available at the Library of Congress website, loc.gov. Go into the search engine, Thomas Jefferson Papers, and you'll find it all. Less than 20 years later, Jefferson would become the first president to invoke what we today call the War Powers Act. He ordered the Navy to North Africa to pacify the Barbary powers without congressional consent. And when the leader of Tripoli conveniently declared war after the United States rejected his demands for more tribute money, Jefferson gladly fought America's first undeclared overseas conflict. It ended when he bought off the pirates, paying $60,000, about $3 million of today's money, to ransom 300 American sailors then in captivity. The price has gone up. It now costs $400 million to bring home Americans from captivity. He also continued to pay tribute to the other Barbary states, a fact many choose to ignore when trying to portray Jefferson as America's first anti-terrorism president. So we grieve and we remember. We celebrate the heroism of Richard Summers, who at 26 years old put the needs of the Navy and the country first. We celebrate the heroism of the firefighters, police, and emergency workers who put the needs of others first. And we remember the cause for which Richard Summers in 1804 and 3,000 in 2001 so gallantly died, freedom. We remember when, in the aftermath of 9/11, for a brief, shining moment, we lived up to the ideals for which Richard Summers and the crew of the Intrepid died, and which our 26th president, Teddy Roosevelt, exhorted us to accept, when there were no hyphens, when we were all Americans. Not Jersey Americans, Shore Americans, not Irish, Italian, African, Chinese, or anything else American, just Americans. It was the title for which Thomas Tomline, Hugh McCormick, Peter Penner, Robert Clark, Jacob Williams, and Isaac Downs died, men who were likely deserters from the Royal Navy. When they enlisted in the United States Navy, they only had to answer one question: do you want to be an American? They answered yes, and they gave their lives on the Intrepid as Americans. We grieve for them, as well as James Harris, James Sims, William Keith, and William Harrison, who also gave their lives on September 4th, 1804. We grieve for Lieutenant Mike Quilty, Ladder 11, Chris Blackwell, Rescue 3, who died September 11, 2001, trying to save others. We grieve for David Tangelin, a young Swedish immigrant who arrived in New York in the summer of 2001 with a dream of working at the World Trade Center and of becoming an American citizen. He died pursuing his dream, sitting at his desk on the 102nd floor when Flight 11 slammed into the North Tower. We grieve for Navy Petty Officer Andrew Clement Jr., a SEAL who died in June fighting in Afghanistan, maintaining the legacy of bravery Richard Summers and the crew of the Intrepid established. Their bravery and our memories of them and all those who died serving our nation, who have died serving in the holy cause of freedom, sustains us. It is why we grieve, we remember, and we don't despair. Thank you.
Thank you. See, I guess maybe it's good that I'm a lawyer as well as a adjunct professor of history, because you could see how easy it is to find different meanings of history from using selected facts. In fact, I begin each history class that I teach at Atlantic Cape Community College by reminding my students of the words of George Orwell. And George Orwell, the author of 1984 and Animal Farm and all these works about how the danger of communism and Nazism taking over America, he said the greatest tool of control and oppression was the misuse of history. He said, he who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past. And what you heard from Mr. Reed is pretty much the standard history being taught in our colleges and our high schools and our mass media, the Hollywood pop culture today. And let me just point out just a couple facts that are missing. When Thomas Jefferson wrote that letter to Congress saying that, and by the way, what prompted that letter? Americans were being captured by these and sold into slavery or held for ransom by these Muslims of North Africa. And Thomas Jefferson was puzzled by that because he said, we didn't know harm to these people. Why are they doing that to us? And so he went to the leaders of England and France and said, you have to help us stop this. And the leaders of England and France said, well, we pay these people bribes or tribute to be left alone. It's cheaper for you to do the same thing. And that astonished Thomas Jefferson. He tried to get the nations of Europe to join with the United States to fight them. But in 1785, we did not have a navy. We didn't even have a country. We didn't have a constitution. We had no way to protect our people. So Thomas Jefferson, then the ambassador to France, got together with John Adams, the ambassador to England, to set up a negotiating session in England to find out why these North African, what they called pirates, were doing this to us. And that's when they said, well, nothing personal, but we are Muslims, we believe in the Quran, and we believe we have a duty to attack and subjugate anyone who is not Muslim because they do not accept the last prophet. And we also believe that anyone who dies fighting the infidel or the unbeliever is rewarded with instant forgiveness of sins and life in paradise. That is what astonished Thomas Jefferson. That is what got him to go throughout the streets of London to get a translation of the Quran so he could read it for himself. And that's when he sent that letter to Congress. And it's interesting that that was not just Thomas Jefferson sending that letter. It was co-signed basically by John Adams, who was a fierce opponent of slavery. John Adams of Massachusetts. But let me go back to, I guess, the basic, what I want to talk about the story. And if you look at this mural, during the past, I guess, a year or two, we've talked about images of that mural, but there are two that we did not do. One on the back side of the building, and I invite you to look at it after we finish the speeches. It shows three graveyards or three memorials. One, the graveyard in Tripoli in North Africa. One is the memorial built in Annapolis to honor Richard Summers. And one is a forgotten monument that is located just a few blocks from here in the schoolyard of the New York Avenue School at First Avenue, right here in Summers Point. And I'm going to read you the inscription of that monument that must have been put there about 100 years ago. And what fascinates me is that every word of that monument has a special meaning. And I'm not going to do the whole thing because it's hot out here. That's one good thing about having the ceremony. But here's what it says. It says, Richard Summers, Master Commandant in the Navy of the United States, born September 15, 1775. He perished in the 25th year of his age in the Kedge Intrepid in the memorable attempt to destroy the Turkish flotilla in the harbor of Tripoli on the night of 4th of September, 1804. Now, Turkish flotilla, wait a minute, we're talking about pirates. We're talking about North Africa. We're talking about Tripoli. Why does the monument talk about the Turkish flotilla? Anyway, it goes on, distinguished for his energy, courage, and manly sense of honor, pro patria non timidius mori. That was a day when most Americans had some basic knowledge of Latin. It means who is for his country is not afraid of death. Now, what we didn't look at is look at that map up there. You'll see it says the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire were the Turks. In studying the history of Islam, I thought I was a history buff. I loved history. That's an area of history I knew absolutely nothing about. When you talk about North Africa, you think of Islam, Muslims. You talk about the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Egypt. You think about Muslims, Islam. But we forget that in the year 600, these were all not Christian countries, and not only Christian countries, this was the heart of the Christian world. But yet in less than 50 years, Damascus in 634, center of Christianity, conquered by Islam. 637, 3 years later, Jerusalem, Christian city, conquered by Islam. Alexandria, Egypt, 646, conquered by Islam. Algeria, 711, conquered by Islam. And when I say Algeria, you think of an Islamic country. But anyone who knows St. Augustine's Prep? Who is St. Augustine's Prep named after? St. Augustine. And where does St. Augustine live? In Algeria, when it was a Christian country. So within 50 years, the heart of the Christian world was wiped out by Islam. And of course, it all changed in Spain, conquered by Islam, 720. And then you had the famous Battle of Tours when the Muslims were defeated at the gates of France. And then you had the Crusades, and things were stable for a while. But then something devastating happened to Europe. A tribe, a very warlike tribe called the Ottoman Turks, converted to Islam. And then the Jihad started up again in the east. 1453, the Muslim Turks wiped out what was left of the Eastern Roman Empire and destroyed the San Sophia Church and converted it into a mosque. And all these events, they mean nothing to us. What do they have to do with Richard Summers? They had a powerful impact on Europe. And then what happened next? What happened was the Turkish, when the Turks wiped out the Eastern Roman Empire and turned the largest Christian church in the world into the largest mosque in the world, the Sultan of the Turks became the Caliph of the Muslim world, the Khalifa. Under Sharia law, he was the one who decided, he was the head of the Islamic world. And what happened after the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire? The conquest continued right up until the gates of Vienna, Austria. And this is where something remarkable happens. On September 11th, does that day sound familiar? Today is September 11th. The day is the day that 15 years ago, the World Trade Center was attacked. To us, September 11th has no significance whatsoever. But in the Islamic world, what happened on September 11th? On September 11th, the Muslim Turks were at the gates of Vienna. They had set off an underground explosion underneath the last wall defending Vienna. September 11th, 1683. They prepared to conquer Vienna, and if you look at the map, you'll see if they broke through Vienna, their next stop was Rome to finish off the conquest of Europe. But then something miraculously happened on the following day, September 12th. That was when the Polish cavalry, commanded by King Jan Sobieski, attacked the Turkish army from the rear. With heavy losses, the Turks were driven out of Europe, and Europe was saved. Probably don't remember any of that history, but in memory of that event, the saving of Europe, the bakers of Vienna gave us two delicacies. They created something called the bagel, a pastry shaped in the stirrups of the Turkish cavalry, and also the croissant, a pastry shaped in the crescent of the Turkish flag. Why do I bring all that stuff up? Because that is the world that Americans stumbled into. So you see that Turkish empire, and you see that that the monument to Richard Somers didn't say he died fighting the Barbary pirates, or it didn't say he died fighting Islam. It says he died trying to destroy the Turkish flotilla that was in Tripoli Harbor. Was it economics? Were they Barbary pirates who just attacked anybody with money? Well, obviously, the Barbary pirates did not attack the Turks. If they did, they wouldn't have lived very long. It was a religious war in the sense that you could rob and pillage the infidels. That's what you were allowed to do. The other interesting thing of forgotten history about that Barbary coast, and I want to really thank Admiral Ron Denny for enlightening me about this. After one Richard Somers ceremony, he handed me a book called The Stolen Village, which described how an entire village in Ireland, it was called Baltimore, Ireland, was kidnapped and sold into slavery in North Africa. And what we forget is that the industry of these North African kingdoms was slavery. They brought millions of black slaves from Africa. They brought millions of white slaves from around the Mediterranean to be sold in the slave markets throughout the Muslim world. In fact, if anyone speaks Spanish, there's an expression. Here we say the coast is clear, to say that it's okay. If you go to anyone in Spanish, that they have a different phrase. It's called "No hay moros en las costa." There are no Muslims along the coast, meaning it's safe because you don't know what's out there. Because if you were in the village, if you were walking along, if these pirates and by the way, they were not pirates. See, a pirate is an outlaw. They were called corsairs, meaning they had a license from their kingdom to plunder certain people. And the only people they were allowed to attack, kill, rob, and enslave were non-Muslims who did not agree to pay tribute. So in a sense, it was economic, but in another sense, it was something more than that. And I won't bore you with all those details, other than to say that because Americans fought back, yes, Richard Somers' mission was a failure, but why did he do that suicide mission? What was he so intent on? Was it because he thought that Thomas Jefferson did not believe in his cause? No, something else had happened in 1804, the year Richard Somers died. In other words, Thomas Jefferson had sent the Navy to fight the Muslims and end the tribute and end the piracy, but something else happened in 1804. And what was that? Well, America was having trouble with France at the time over the Mississippi River. And the top priority was to have freedom of trade along the Mississippi River. And during the negotiations, the French surprised Thomas Jefferson and said, well, we can fix the problem real quick. We're going to sell you every piece of land we own called Louisiana in the Mississippi. If you give us, I believe it was something like $4 million. So what happened was Thomas Jefferson wanted to buy Louisiana, and there was no more money to fight this war in the Mediterranean. So Richard Somers knew, and his crew knew, if they did not win a decisive victory, that Congress and Thomas Jefferson would bring them back before their job was done. That's why they made that sacrifice. And although they did not win that battle, the following year, when Thomas Jefferson sent the ransom money to free everybody, the first thing they did is they disobeyed orders, the naval officers. They hired mercenaries and brought the Marines to the shores of Tripoli, and only later, after threatening to seize Tripoli, was a deal struck, money was exchanged. The story gets a little complicated. But it's good to remember this history. It's good to have these yearly discussions with Chip Reed, because over the years I've gotten a few things wrong. He corrected me. Again, I'm hoping I'm adding some things. But we've got to teach this stuff to our kids in school. There ought to be a movie about Richard Summers. There ought to be a movie about all these things, so that it ought to be on TV, but it's not. And hopefully little ceremonies like this could change it. The final point I'd like to do is, yes, that with Liberty and Prosperity, we spend some money putting out the publicity. If you saw this on Facebook, if you saw the radio ads, and I certainly hope that you will help us defray some of these expenses by going to Gregory's across the street and taking part in a little fundraiser. I think it's $25 a ticket. You can pay at the door, and that's where we get the money to have this event year after year. So I'm going to go back to Sally Hastings, because I know I must have forgotten something. And if I did, Sally, please save me. Thank you.
The past few years, we've been fortunate to have some people from Somers, New York with us. In 2012, we became a sister city with Somers, New York. Their community was originally called Stephentown, and then I forgot the year, around 1806, 1807, there was another Stephentown in New York, and they had to change their name. The fame of Richard Summers had gotten to their little community, so they actually selected the name of Somers and renamed their community as Somers, New York. So we became a sister city with them in 2012. They've been down here a number of times, and I go up there occasionally. Actually, I'm going up Friday night, and I'm going to have dinner with Grace from the from the Somers Historical Society, and with Luigi Badia and his wife Kendi. Now, Luigi Badia is the one who sculpted Richard Summers here. So I've been able to keep in touch with them and see them every once in a while. They were not able to come down today because they had a 9/11 ceremony up there that Grace and the Historical Society had to be involved with. So I have a letter from her. My schedule precludes me from joining you today, but I offer these thoughts. Please know we are with you in spirit. September 11th, 2016 is an extraordinary day in history. Today we gather for ceremonies commemorating many brave Americans who paid the ultimate sacrifice in the hands of the same enemy we fight today, Islamic terrorists. Only difference, they died more than 2 centuries apart. Richard Summers and his comrades in September of 1804, and the heroes of the September 11 attacks in 2011. And they did have a number of people that died at the World Trade Center from Somers, New York, so that's a special ceremony for them. Ironically, these Americans fought people from the same region of the world during the same month of the year. And this year we honor them all on the same date, Sunday, September 11th, 2016. So on this extraordinary day, I hope everyone will reflect on all the terrorist events of past Septembers and use the knowledge to guide us into the future. History truly does repeat itself. And this is actually a duplicate bust of Richard Summers. The original is located in Somers, New York, and today they're gathering for their 9/11 ceremony around the same bust, a slightly different shaped monument there in Somers, New York. So on behalf of the Somers Point Historical Society, I thank you for attending. Seth, do you have any further comments? I also want to thank the City of Somers Point as well for allowing us to use this. The Somers Point Historical Society did raise funds, and we put the monument up here, and the signage and the different brochures and the racks. The Somers Point Arts Commission, in conjunction with the Somers Point Historical Society, last year the mural project was dedicated, so I'm very proud to have been a part of both of those projects.
You're going to regret this, Sally, because I just remembered one more thing I wanted to bring up. And that was, you have this back and forth. When the Muslim corsairs of North Africa attacked the Americans, were they in it for the money, or was it part of their jihad? And you heard the little dispute. Ironically, while all this was going on in North Africa, there was a Muslim preacher, a radical Muslim preacher in Arabia, who actually agreed with Mr. Reed that the Turks had forgotten about jihad. They were just attacking it for the money. They had lost their Muslim principles. They were turning this into a business. They were the leaders of the Muslim world. They were the caliphs, the caliphs, but they were no longer worthy of it because they were no longer taking Islam seriously. And therefore, according to this Muslim preacher, the Turks were no longer deserving of the caliphate and should be overthrown and replaced by a new Arab Muslim movement that would do things right in the Muslim world. The name of that preacher was called Wahhab. He lived just about 20 years before Richard Summers died. And his benefactor, the guy who gave him money and who encouraged him, was a man named Saud, S-A-U-D, or the Saudi family. And eventually, for 200 years, the Wahhabs and the Saudis were agitating against the Turks, saying they were no longer pure enough to lead the Muslim world, but they were treated like a bunch of hicks and weren't taken seriously until 1915. Something happened in 1915 that suddenly made these radical Arab Muslims, the Wahhabs and the Saudis, the most powerful people in the Muslim world. And they were, number one, that the British armed the Arabs as allies with Lawrence of Arabia and taught them modern warfare. And also oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia, which made the radical Saudi family the richest and most powerful Arab family in the Muslim world. So that, in a way, something to be explored academically in future discussions. So hopefully, I'm thirsty. I'm going to go over to Gregory's. Thank you so much. And Sally has one more.
Okay, we're going to bring the flag down, so please rise. So the Boy Scouts will come forward to bring the flag down. Thank you for attending.